let's get started. I'm Tom Barnes. This is the 78 podcast for stories from the 78 website. Interesting week this week. Went to the Chicago Magic Lounge for a segment for CBS, and that place is incredible in terms of the history of magic in Chicago. If you've never been, it's a laundromat on the outside. It's like a speakeasy, right? And you go inside. It's not what you think right when you're outside at the laundromat. You're thinking, what is this place going to look like, right? Then you go in, and it's unbelievable. It's spectacular. It's beautiful on the inside. And Joey, the owner, knows so much about Chicago magic, and there's so much magic that goes all the way back to Houdini. It's actually really cool to hear about it and the way table magic started back in Chicago years and years ago. I mean, as a kid, I remember going to restaurants where I could remember always thinking that maybe we go to the restaurant that had the guys that come around and do magic at your table. Like, that was a thing that started in Chicago. To this day, I know of one place for sure, O'Donovan's on the north side, right on Irving Park Road. That place does tableside magic, and the gentleman that does tableside magic at O'Donovan's also does it at the Chicago Magic Lounge. So if you ever get a chance, go out and do that. Last week, I also spent time with a chef. His name is Brian Enyart, and he is the chef for the Lena Brava restaurant in Chicago's West Loop. He has been, though, with Rick Bayless and a bunch of entities of Rick Bayless, Topola Bombo, and Frontera Grill for many, many years. And he also started his own restaurant with his wife in Logan Square that was hugely successful. And the pandemic kind of got him in the end with that one. But his story is incredible. And if you go over the website, you click, it's called the Lauded Chef Brian Enyart, named Executive Chef of West Loop's Lena Brava. And we got to sit down and talk about his career. The guy likes to run, and I didn't know that, which I thought was interesting in terms of how somebody who is in a restaurant and on their feet all day, then they want to go out and run miles and miles at a time. So much so that he's run a couple marathons, and he's a South Sider. His mom lives in Tinley Park, and he heads down to the South Side to hang out with his mom when he can, and he'll run. And I just think it's really cool, a chef to his caliber who's done many great things, finds time to go out and run marathons. And he posted some of his journeys on an Instagram page that's captured in the story that I wrote with him here. And I don't know, it was a great time to sit down and talk with him before the restaurant opened. Got a kind of a sneak peek of the restaurant before it opens and all their checks and everything else. And if you're a fan of the Bear, you'll love this interview because you kind of see all the things that go on in a restaurant of the caliber of restaurant that he works at. And it is one of the very few open fire grills in Chicago. And when I mean by open fire, it is a restaurant that doesn't have a regular stove or whatnot. No, it's like open fire, like campfire. Like, they have logs of wood they throw under the thing and they make it, oven, everything. So very cool, and it gives you that really distinctive taste that's really good. And we talked about the difficulties and figuring out how to bake and cook with that type of setup. It was a new obstacle for him to kind of figure out after being in a kitchen that had the gas-powered stove and all that good stuff. So very interesting and a lot of fun. So if you're in the Chicago area, you're always looking for a day trip to get out of the city for a little bit. And lately, I know a lot of people that have been heading north to Milwaukee. And I don't know why I said it like that. That's weird. Anyhow, I'm not going to edit it. I don't care. But going up to Milwaukee is actually a good time. And a lot of Chicagoans go up that way for Summerfest or what have you right now to see the Bucks, because the Bucks are pretty good. And always with the Brew Crew and the Cubs and the whole thing. But there's a really cool statue up in Milwaukee that, if you're anywhere the age I am, you kind of grew up on reruns of Happy Days. Happy Days with the Fonz and Ron Howard and Henry Winkler playing the Fonz, I should say. So it's just, whatever. You grew up watching it. You probably were kind of like mad that it came on versus like your Saturday morning cartoons or your weekday cartoons or Different Strokes or, Small Wonder or whatever the heck you wanted to watch. Happy Days came on. So you kind of watch it sometimes begrudgingly, and it became part of what you knew. So you go up to Milwaukee. They have a river walk up there, and it's really pretty river walk. Downtown Milwaukee has come a long way in the way that they invite tourists to kind of hang out. It's a big art city, so they have a lot of public art, and there's a hotel up that way that it's all based on art, and it's the same company that owns a movie studio franchise, theater franchise, not like the movie studios, but a theater franchise. So anyhow, you go up there, and just south of Water Street on the Milwaukee Riverwalk, you will see a bronze Fonz, and that's exactly what it is. It's a bronze statue of the Fonz, and it was something that happened back in the day. TV Land was doing like promotions like in early 2007 where they were having one for the Mary Tyler Moore Show and the Honeymooners and all that stuff when like TV Land was becoming like a really big deal. And they were going to do one for the Fonz, and then they didn't. They scrapped it for whatever reason. So Visit Milwaukee, I think, is the nonprofit that sets up all these interesting things around the city for people to come and hang out at the city. They were like, no, we're going to do a Fonz statue because that's where Happy Days took place in Milwaukee. So they did, and it pissed off a couple people, so much so that the head of one of the organizations, he was like, if you're going to build this stupid statue here, then I'm closing up and moving. And guess what? They did. They closed up and moved for the sake of art, which I think is ironic because despite it being the Fonz, it's still artwork, right? Somebody created it. It was it was commissioned by a sculptor. So somebody had to like create the whole thing. And so I find it interesting that an artist was so disgusted by the commercial art that they moved. I mean, so talk about, that's something I would think about hearing like in New York City or something like that, not in Milwaukee, but us Midwesterners, we get a little crabby, I should say. A really great experience I had this past week was going down to Roseland. Now, Roseland is a area of Chicago that was a thriving community in the 40s and 50s and 60s even. It was a huge South Side community, kind of like what maybe like Beverly, Mount Greenwood, or even Oak Lawn are now. And now Oak Lawn's a suburb, but Roseland was, a lot of people I knew that their parents grew up in Roseland or Auburn Gresham, and it's close to Pullman. In Pullman, huge area. It's the only national park in Chicago where they have that, about the Pullman Railroad and all that good stuff. So Roseland's right just to the west of it. And Roseland has a great donut place on 115th Street. It's amazing donut place, and you have to check it out if you're ever down in Roseland. Another great aspect of Roseland is the hospital that has been there for 100 years, the Roseland Community Hospital. Why am I talking about a hospital? Well, it's one of the only hospitals left on Chicago's South Side, and they have figured out a way to stay relevant and to continue to offer services, and including like free mammograms. And they have these beautiful maternity ward suites for moms where they can hook them up with stuff to help them get their life started with their baby. And it's just a place, it's more of a community hub than it is a hospital. I've been there when they've had coat drives. I've been there when they've had turkey drives. I've been there just about everything they do to try to like raise awareness that this is a beacon of light in an area that's kind of been forgotten by a lot of politicians, let's say, in Chicago. And Roseland is a real proud community. It's a, like I said, it's a hardworking South Side community. A lot of people back in the day would work there, and, they would either work downtown or they work at the steel mills that were on the South Side. And, and then the 60s, the Great White Flight happened and lots of people left, and Roseland, didn't do well. It's like, I'm talking like Michigan Avenue in 111th. That's kind of where we're at here. And the hospital's right on 111th and Wentworth. And, but it's a really great story. And if you're down that way and you're looking to help or volunteer, I would suggest going over to the Roseland Community Hospital, just because they're doing great work, and they're kind of the little engine that could. People have forgotten about them. And, I don't know. It's just a really inspiring story that I think a lot of us could take and question how we help our neighborhoods. How do we help our community? And Roseland has done that. It's just a wonderful place to check out. I gotta tell you, I got to go to like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, like for real. Like the Ferrara Candy Company bought like the Willy Wonka brand for as far as candy is concerned, and they make the everlasting gobstoppers. They make nerds. They make nerd ropes. They make sweet tart ropes. They make all the things. Like so, you go. They have a few facilities around Chicago, and I don't know if you knew this, but Chicago, for the most part, is kind of like the candy capital of the United States. A lot of candy's been made here or was made here, but still lots are still made here, including nerds. And nerds, fun story I'll give you real quick. And this, I can't quote them 100% because it's lore at this point more than actual fact that they want to like write down. But either way, I think it's a cool story. That's dumb. Why did I say that? It's just a fun place. It's just a really inspirational place of Chicagoans helping each other. And it's a place that you should definitely check out if you're down on the South Side, if you want to learn how to help for volunteering for your fellow Chicagoans. So there you go. That's my PSA for the day. Nerds. Nerds. You know the candy. You know Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Do you know Chicago kind of has their own Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? It's basically the Ferrara Candy Company that's been in Chicago, I believe, since 1908. So they've been around for a long time making candy that has been shipped all over the world. I got to hang out and see how they make nerds, everlasting gobstoppers, nerd clusters, nerd ropes, sweet tart ropes. The whole thing happens in the Ferrara Candy Company lexicon. They have a few bakeries or facilities. I don't know what they're not really bakeries. Around Chicago, they have one right in Forest Park, I believe, right off of like the Eisenhower Expressway. And then the one I went to was in Itasca. And that's where they make the nerd clusters. And they told me that the nerd clusters is like the #1 selling candy in North America. And they make it right here in Chicago, which I think is great. And a fun story, I asked a couple of people, when we do these segments, it's funny. We do these segments for either CBS or for myself or the website here. You go to visit these places. It's not like one person that's like watching you do your job for the day. At this particular, they were very excited, which I get. I would be excited. There was probably like 10 people like following us around, watching us. And, their one was the safety person where we had to do all the safety stuff, which I 100% agree with and understand. Then there's other people, the PR person, and then this person and this person, making sure that we don't wander off and do anything that we're not supposed to do. So when we had a break in the morning, we were in the conference room and they were talking about nerds, and nerds have been around for like 40 years now. I think it was 82 or 83 is when nerds started. But nerds started because of an accident almost, which I think is just a really great story. The everlasting gobstoppers, they're pan candy, meaning that they kind of are in a pan and they're moving constantly. You're adding layers and layers of sugar and flavor to the gobstopper to make it big and make it last forever, right? So they said that back in the early 80s, they were making the gobstoppers in the plant, and a couple of the folks, I don't know if they were engineers or I have no idea what they did there, but they worked on the line for the gobstoppers, right? And they noticed that, sometimes the gobstoppers would chip and they would end up at the bottom of the pan, and then they gather all that stuff and they would throw it away. They discard it, right? And they were making gobstoppers for a while, right? So then somebody was like, you know what? Like the stuff that is the leftovers of the broken gobstoppers, like the crumbs, if you will, they're still really good. Like, they would eat them. And somebody's like, maybe we should make these into something, like this could really be something. And then they started to manufacture the crumbs of the gobstoppers, which are now nerds, which I think is just a cool story about how, it's almost like sustainability way before it was popular, like let's take the leftovers and make it into something else, because people used to just sample it in the factory. They have like the discard area, and then wherever they would go, people were like, well, I don't throw that away because that's still good, and they would eat it. So somebody got the idea of making that something. Then I asked, like, well, why are they called nerds? And basically, this is where it gets a little fuzzy on why. But pretty much back in the early 80s, like nerd, saying somebody was a nerd or nerd fashion of some kind, was a very popular thing. You know, like there was the movie Nerds, Revenge of the Nerds, Nerds in Paradise, or the whole thing, right? Those were early 80s movies, and pop culture at that time. The word nerd was kind of a big deal, right? So they're kind of just cashing in on something that was really popular at the time. The name stuck, and the candy brand took off, kind of like Baby Ruth. You know, if you know Baby Ruth, the candy bar, that was named after Babe Ruth, the baseball player. And, you know, Babe Ruth has been long gone, but the candy's still here. And the kind of the same deal with Nerds, except it wasn't named after a person. It was named after an, colloquialism of what people would say, you know, like let's nerd out. I mean, it was almost before what it is used for now, but back then. So I don't know, super cool. And that one, we did it at the Ferrara Candy Company in Itasca, and that's over at CBS2 Chicago.com or CBSChicago.com, I should say. And that was one of the coolest jump starts segments we've done, and one of the cool stories I've done in my history of my career, from over at WGN and over here now at CBS. So a lot of fun. The thing that I will wrap up with this week is a really fascinating story about 97.9 The Loop, an old rock station in Chicago that was like the torch of rock and roll, punk rock, and really changed radio forever. It started off in like 1977. I talked to my friend Rick, who was a producer for like Stephen Gary, I believe, back in the day. And if you know anything about Chicago radio or like Disco Demolition or Stephen Gary, Jonathan Brandmeier, all that stuff was happening at the Loop from 77. And it flipped formats, I think, like 5 or 6 years ago. And ironically enough, is now a Christian rock station, but it still exists on the HD radio. So if you're in your car, you know, you have those HD channels in your car, you can still get the Loop. I think it's on like Q101's HD sister station channel or something like that. Anyhow, a fascinating explanation of just what happened with the Loop and how big it became. I mean, it was like Johnny and the Leisure Suits, which is Jonathan Brandmeier's band, has the highest attended concert at Poplar Creek in their history. Now, Poplar Creek doesn't exist anymore as a music venue, but it's very much like like the whatever it's called in Tinley Park now, the Hollywood Amphitheater or the First Midwest Bank Amphitheater, whatever it is, down in Tinley Park. It used to be called the World Music Theater, and that's when the Loop was around, when it was like the World Music Theater. And that, my friends, though, is a fascinating story about just how much Chicago loved their radio stars, because radio back then in Chicago, from I would say like the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, was like the equivalent of like how Hollywood deals with movie stars, right? Chicago, very much the radio personalities and the athletes here. And so far it's shifted over the years. Now it's more about its athletes and maybe chefs and influencers and things like that. Not so much radio stars anymore, and some TV people, but not like it was back in the 80s and 90s. But the stories that Rick tells are all accounts from the people themselves. Like he asked them, and the book is basically their recount of the entire experience that they had at the Loop. So you had, Kevin Matthews and Jonathan Brammer, and, my buddy Jeff Hoover over at WGN was a part of that. Robin Baumgarten was part of the Loop back in the day on the Johnny B Show. So a lot of history of like Chicago media, but the radio station itself was I would say it was a icon for the country of like punk rock and classic rock eventually and all that stuff. It was just a really great station, kind of no holds barred. I know they're working on a documentary about it, but the book itself, if you read the book, I'll tell you, like, you won't believe that this kind of stuff happened. Like, they didn't care that they got fined by the FCC. Like, there's a story in the book where they looked and like, oh, we're going to get fined $6,000 if we say a swear on the air, or if we do something crude. Like, we're making millions. We can afford the $6,000 essentially. And, Johnny B was making millions of dollars at the time. And this is back in the 80s and 90s, like millions of dollars these jocks were getting paid. Stephen Gary, same thing. I'm making millions of dollars, like Danny Bonaducci. And then the list goes on and on. These guys made tons of money because this station was a huge draw. And the irony of it all, and the funny way that it kind of like died, Stephen Gary were on the air, and they were about to go national. They were about to be syndicated, and the day before or the week before, something very close to like when they were going to take the station and kind of syndicate the entire thing, right? And it would be out of Chicago and all this stuff. And Chicago very often gets overlooked about, versus New York and LA. But Chicago knows how to do entertainment. We did Oprah, Donahue, Jerry Springer, and The Loop was a product of Chicago. And I believe the people that are in Chicago and how we look at things. And right before it was about to go national and syndicated, Steve and Gary broke up, and that was it. And it kind of fell apart after that. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of The Loop. And now it, like I said, it lives on in the HD world. But if you go to the FM dial, it is a Christian rock station. So anyhow, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you guys next week. Remember, storiesfromthe78.com, or you can follow me at TomsBarnes78. Thanks a lot.